Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And let's get started talking about Korean. And by Korean, I mean South Korean democratization and economic development. I assume people are familiar with the three images on here. What do we have?
Genesis?
Yeah, we have a Hyundai automobile, the Genesis subline, BTS, and also Samsung phones. Okay, so first let's start with the founding of South Korea in 1948. Syngman Rhee was the first president. He was president from 1948 till 1960. On the first line, you have he was the years of his birth and death. So he was born 1875. So he was quite an older leader already at this time. He was elected in 48 and 52, and then again in 56 and 60. Now, originally they had planned on having term limits, but he actually went up for election 4 times. So the first republic is what they call the first constitution. So under Syngman Rhee, there was a first constitution, and this is a time that was marked by the division because the two Koreas after World War II were under joint trusteeship of the Soviets and the Americans. And in 1948, they weren't able to form one single country. So they ended up divided. And then in 1950 to 1953, they were at war. And then after that was the Cold War. And technically, the Korean War never ended. So the two Koreas are still at war. Syngman Rhee, in order to hold on to his power, instated the National Security Law, which was a law that had a very broad and vague understanding of what sedition meant. So basically, if you spoke out against Syngman Rhee, even during a political election, you were committing sedition, which was grounds for imprisonment or even death. So his opponent in the 1956 presidential election was executed for treason because he obviously, running as an opponent, spoke out against Syngman Rhee. His 1960 opponent died before the election. Under Syngman Rhee, the South Korean economy was really building and rebuilding from the war. So their immediate goal was import substitution. And throughout the 1950s, they were really very heavily reliant on aid, specifically US aid. If we look at between 45 and 65, they received $12 billion of US aid, which right now would pay for like 2 paper clips, but back then was quite sizable. 1957, you have figures here on the different kinds of aid. And so pretty much even in 1960, South Korea was very much a struggling building economy. Their gross national product was maybe about gross national product was maybe $100 per capita. Okay, April 6, 1960, after Syngman Rhee running for election 4 times, they had the April 1960 student revolution, and there was massive use of military force against civilian protesters. This began on April 12th when they discovered a 17-year-old high school student's body killed during the protests. April 19th, more civilians joined in, and somewhere more than 100 people were killed, more than 1,000 injured. And at this point, the head of the military command the martial law commander put down his arms and said he would not shoot against the civilians anymore. Syngman Rhee then lost US support and he resigned on April 29th. And here he is leaving for exile in Hawaii. And that is the first lady. And one thing that you may not be familiar with is actually the very first lady in South Korea was actually a white woman. She was Austrian, named Francesca Rhee. Okay, so after Syngman Rhee was a brief attempt at democratization. So they decided that instead of having a strong president, they were going to have a whole new constitution. They called this the Second Republic, and the prime minister would really be the one who had the most power. Sorry, my internet's a little stable. You may lose me for a second here and there. So the student revolution brought about this desire for democracy in South Korea. They had the Second Republic. Chang Myon, also known as John Chang, was the prime minister. There was a president, but the president really had very little power. And for the first time, they also decided to give people more direct rights. So people were able to vote for provincial governors and for the mayor of Seoul. And that was the first time. But shortly thereafter, Park Geun-hye, a general, staged a coup. And although Chang Myon, the prime minister, asked for US assistance, the US actually declined to intervene because this was during the Cold War, and the United States was most concerned about having a strong anti-communist ally. And so Park Geun-hye ruled through this junta that was called the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction. And in 1963, he ran for election. So basically, John Chang, the prime minister, was ousted, and Park Geun-hye ran for president, and he won in 63 and 67, and then again in 71. However, his 71 election result was really precarious. So in 72, he staged a coup in office and basically came up with a new constitution. So under him was a third republic and the fourth republic. And in 1972, the president under that constitution would have 6-year terms. And the sitting president also was head of the electoral body, which basically would make him able to keep winning presidential elections. And here he is during the coup, and then later as a civilian, as president. So Park Geun-hye was president for a long time. And his coup in office, he called that the Yushin Constitution. And the Fourth Republic was established in 72, basically effectively making him president for life. The electoral body that the sitting president headed was called the National Council for Unification. And Park's presidency ended in 1979 when he was assassinated by the head of his own Central Intelligence Agency. And his first lady had been killed in 1974. Some of the things that happened under Park Geun-hye was the 1965 ROK's Republic of Korea, Japan Normalization Treaty. Now, this was really controversial because some people didn't want South Korea to re-engage with Japan after the end of the colonial period and end of World War II. The two sides basically only had unofficial contacts. However, 1965, they normalized relations, reestablished diplomatic ties, and this brought a total of about $800 million to South Korea. So it really helped spark the South Korean steel industry, shipbuilding industry, automobile industry, which was really very far-reaching for this time, where South Korea still had been very much focused on import substitution. And there were some Koreans who protested this normalization with Japan. The year after, as Ernest had talked about, South Korea entered the Vietnam War. So the two countries signed this Brown Memorandum, and this brought about $1 billion to South Korea. And about 50,000 South Korean soldiers were deployed at any given time for a total of about 300,000 people total. This also not only brought South Korean soldiers to the Vietnam War, which was brought in a lot of money for the South Korean economy and the government, because South Korean soldiers were paid at the same rate as American combat soldiers. However, instead of the soldiers getting most of this, it did go to South Korea, the government. There are also many Korean companies that started at this time because they were suppliers to the Vietnam War effort. So for example, Korean Air, which is a huge airline today, got started at this time as well. Also, many of South Korea's steel exports, other equipment went to Vietnam. Okay, so in terms of Park's economic development, there are a series of 5-year plans, and he also pushed for certain chaebol. So chaebol means conglomerate, and these are companies like Hyundai and Samsung that were targeted for economic development. And there was a lot of heavy industries, like, for example, it really was quite remarkable that South Korea even thought to have a shipbuilding industry, auto industry, construction. They established these special economic zones where they would have factories and really focus on export or oriented industrialism. Were able to get, uh, uh, people who lived in thatched roof houses were able to replace those roofs. And throughout this time, there's a lot of sacrifices by workers, and labor unions were oppressed in order to focus on economic development and strengthening the nation. Okay, so after Park Geun-hye's assassination in 1979, there was another attempt at democratization. Choi Kyu-ha was became the next president. However, there was immediately thereafter, within about 8 weeks of Park Geun-hye's assassination, there was a coup by Chun Doo-hwan, who tried to have the same kind of coup that Park Geun-hye had successively had. So Chun Doo-hwan staged his coup, and 8 months later, he ran for president with the same electoral body as under Park Geun-hye, and he won. So his presidency is called the Fifth Republic, and from there, the new constitution said presidents would all only have one single term, no more multiple terms. Chun Doo-hwan's administration was accused of many human rights abuses. Many people, like politicians, government officials, even business leaders, were purged. And many students, journalists, teachers, organizers, even civil servants were sent to re-education camps at this time. South Korea continued its export-oriented economic plan, and also many South Korean construction firms had large-scale projects abroad where South Koreans went to work in construction, and the auto industry also really took off during this time. These are some photos of the May 18th Gwangju democratization movement, some real pictures on the left. And also, if you're interested in this time period, there is a really interesting film called Taxi Driver. Not the one with Al Pacino, but this is the Korean Taxi Driver with very different plot. So the Gwangju democratization movement took place in May of 1980, shortly after Chun Doo-hwan's coup. And this was officially called a North Korean communist plot. Paratroopers were sent in, and they committed a lot of violence against civilians that resulted in a massacre of civilians. The citizens of Gwangju fought back. They commandeered the city, asked the United States for help, but they were denied. The military put up a blockade around the city, and then a few days later ended up retaking the city. So right now, the figures from the Truth and Reconciliation Committee are that about 230 civilians were killed. At one time, that they thought it was as many as 2,000, according to Amnesty International. And this is also when people started to say that the United States had a role in this massacre of civilians, because the status of forces agreement between the United States and South Korea said that the paratroopers that were sent into Gwangju were actually under US command. Now the US the US forces commander had said, no, he was not in a position to give permission. He had only been notified that the paratroopers were being sent in. But this disappointment for the civilians, for the people who wanted democratization in South Korea, led to the radicalization of many of the protesters and also rise of anti-Americanism. So after Chun Doo-hwan, because he had promised that he'd only be president for one term, his handpicked successor was Do Tae-woo. He had been part of the 1979 coup, and there were also many opposition candidates who ran at this time. And Do Tae-woo issued this June 29th proclamation, which said that he, as a candidate, was endorsing direct presidential elections and greater freedoms. And if the sitting president, Chun Doo-hwan, didn't accept these terms, then Roh Tae-woo would not run. So Chun Doo-hwan accepted these terms, and that also boosted Roh Tae-woo's image as a candidate. So the election took place in December of 1987, and there was really a split, not only with, Roh Tae-woo got the most votes, but he didn't get the majority because there were opposition candidates. So this was the establishment of the Sixth Republic, or the Sixth Constitution, but it really was a continuation of the same Chun regime. And also, the world's attention was on South Korea because this was right before the Seoul Olympics, and people wanted to see that South Korea was on the path to democratization. So some people say that democratization is a natural outcome of economic growth, because as a country becomes more prosperous, the people want more freedoms, more democratization. Also, other people say students, intellectuals, labor groups, so many people came together at this point, really rallied together for democratization. Not just these groups, but also religious groups across different religions, Buddhist, Christian churches, both Catholic and Protestant, even shamans. Also, the middle class really also supported democratization at this time, and many different women's groups. So we really see how at this point it's seems to be a huge movement, and it is at this point inevitable. This is a political rally in 1987. This one was for Kim Dae-jung, but you can see just the scale of people who turned out and really wanted democratization and freedom, and were exercising their freedom to have the first direct election. So not through an electoral body, but direct, one person, one vote. Okay. The person who won the next election is Kim Young-sam. He was actually one of the other opposition candidates in 87, but he was elected in 92, and he was the first truly civilian president since Syngman Rhee, or before, because he hadn't been part of the coup. So initially he was popular. He ran on an anti-corruption campaign, and also advocated for greater civilian control over the military so that there wouldn't be other coups. And under Kim Young-sam, he also put on trial the two former presidents, Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-woo, and I won't go over all the details, but they were sentenced and then pardoned in 1998 by the next president. Kim Young-sam's presidency ended with the Asian financial crisis and IMF bailout in 1997, which I'll also talk about. So this whole IMF crisis, as it's most widely known in Korea, began in July, and it's because the banking sector had weakened due to making some bad loans that they couldn't collect. The Dvlp system had some systemic problems, like, for example, they might borrow money from one subsidiary, but then transfer that to another subsidiary that wasn't doing as well. So there are also a lot of excessive debts and shortage of foreign currency in South Korea at this time. And when their revolving credit, which is like our credit cards, when they got revoked, saying, okay, now you just have to pay up, and there wasn't the money to pay, this became a problem. The currency, which had been at about 801 to the dollar, devalued to 1701 to the dollar. Today it's at about 1100. The stock market plunged. The International Monetary Fund went in with a large $58 billion bailout, which many people opposed because of all the conditions that come with an IMF bailout. However, this was repaid in 2001 ahead of schedule. So the next president was Kim Dae-jung. So he became president right at the start of the IMF crisis. And he had been this longtime opposition leader. In fact, in 1971, he ran against Park Geun-hye. He won at that time officially 36% of the popular vote. But since many people didn't trust the government figures, what his actual election results were, we don't know. 1971, he was run over by a truck, not an accident, one that was orchestrated by the Park Geun-hye regime. He was kidnapped in 73, saved from being thrown overboard in the ocean, and he was kept under house arrest till 79. And so when Chun Doo-hwan staged his coup at the end of 1979, the military put Kim Dae-jung in jail. And so he was actually in jail when the Gwangju uprising started. Nonetheless, he was indicted for having incited it, and he was supposed to be executed but exiled to the United States instead. He returned in 1985. So when this longtime opposition leader was elected president in 1997, it really marked the full democratization in South Korea. It was the first time an opposition party candidate had successfully won a presidential election, and it also he was also from a region that generally had not been in power. So Kim Dae-jung became president, and his primary concern was economic recovery from the financial crisis, but this was also a time where he, as he had pledged for many years, followed a policy of engagement with North Korea, what he called the Sunshine Policy after Aesop's fable. And for this, in 2000, he had the first North-South summit between the two Koreas and won the Nobel Peace Prize. After him was Roh Moo-hyun, another candidate from the same party. He was a self-educated lawyer and a supporter of Kim Dae-jung. However, Roh Moo-hyun in 2004 was actually impeached for illegal electioneering and incompetence, which in South Korea, a president can't campaign for his party, and he did. So that was called illegal electioneering. However, he was not removed from office, and he held the second North-South summit. And after his presidency ended in 2008, he committed suicide over political issues. He was being investigated by the next president, and he committed suicide not out of guilt, but rather out of protesting the political, what he felt was improper witch hunting. So there he is at the second summit. That was his actual funeral was not public, but this was outside his funeral. Many people turned out in support. So the next president after him was Lee Myung-bak, who was often called the CEO president because he had been chair of Hyundai Construction. He'd been a member of the National Assembly, and he was also former mayor of Seoul. And this marked the pendulum shifting back to the right, and we had the Blue House, as the presidential residence is called, shift back to the conservatives. Now, because he had been a businessman, people were very optimistic that his economic policies would help South Korea. His policy was called MBnomics for his initials, MB, and he also had a lot of policies that favored businesses and the rich. This was also when the worldwide recession hit, and South Korea is said to be the first country to recover from that, and they said it was due to the CEO president. In 2010, South Korea hosted the G20 summit. Lee Myung-bak also finalized the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement and also one with the European Union. One of the things that happened under him was also, as a part of the free trade agreement with the United States, he lifted all restrictions on US beef at a time where people were very much concerned about mad cow disease, and people turned out in droves to protest that. And then after him was another conservative or party president, Park Geun-hye, who also marked the very first female president in South Korea. People often equated her with Margaret Thatcher, called her the Iron Lady, and under Park Geun-hye, we saw more conflict with North Korea, and the closure of the Kaesong Industrial Complex, which is one of the things that had started under Kim Dae-jung. Now, Park Geun-hye, her last name is Park, or her surname is Park, and she is the daughter of the earlier president Park Chung-hee, who ruled Korea from 1961 until 1979. During her presidency, we saw the Sewol ferry disaster, where many of the people killed were young students. And also what ultimately undid her was what some people called Choi Soon-sil Gate. Her longtime friend and advisee without government clearance was discovered to have really advised her without having government clearance. And also that her friend had coerced almost $70 million from corporations to be funneled to sham charities. Also, they pointed to other things that they found, like Che's daughter got preferential treatment and was accepted at Ewha Women's University, which led to the president of the university resigning. Now, Park Geun-hye was impeached and removed from office. So she wasn't the first South Korean president to be impeached, but she was the first to be removed. The economy under Park Geun-hye was called the creative economy. They wanted to promote what they called creativity without barriers. So combining, for example, science, technology and industry, or culture and industry. The economy was sluggish during this time. She proposed a 3-year economic plan. But when she was removed from office a year early, Moon Jae-in became the next president. Again, we see the pendulum shift. This is the Liberal Party candidate, and there were a lot of different domestic difficulties during this time. Moon Jae-in was also balancing not only North Korea, but also the United States and the Trump administration. So Moon Jae-in had 3 summits with North Korea, balancing really, the carrot and the stick with North Korea. In terms of US relations, he deployed THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System, which was opposed vehemently by China. This is also a time where Trump had said that South Korea needed to pay more. South Korea actually does pay quite a lot for US troops. So this was renegotiated, as well as different trade issues. And also under Moon Jae-in, who's still president, there were trade wars with China and Japan. So in terms of South Korea and China, it began really with the deployment of THAAD. And in 2017, China halted tourism to South Korea and restricted many Korean businesses from doing business in China. And that also meant that, for example, Korean entertainers could not perform in China. Tensions eased somewhat in 2018. And China is a huge trading partner to not only South Korea, but also North Korea. In terms of South Korea and Japan, this began a couple of years ago. Japan placed restrictions on certain Korean materials, and also this led to an escalation and reductions in trade and tourism. And the thing about South Korea and Japan is that because of the Japanese colonial experience, many Koreans have this long-standing animosity toward Japan. And so here you see a picture in a supermarket where it says they're not selling Japanese products. Okay, I've got a little picture show here for you. This is a picture of what was really downtown Seoul, and this section in the Cheonggyecheon, which is a stream that ran through downtown, you see really, stilt houses, but not the fancy kind if you're familiar with LA, not the fancy stilt houses we have in the Hollywood Hills, but rather very precarious homes. So they drained this stream, and the houses on the stream weren't all the stilt houses, but here we see much fancier houses, but they drained it and they started to put up the pylons. You see the pylons there. You see these huts where these over here, they're not even on stilts. They're just right there on the banks. And it became this elevated roadway through downtown Seoul. And then eventually was removed, and under Lee Myung-bak as mayor, it was actually turned into this beautiful urban park. which here's a night view. Okay, so milestones for South Korea: the 1988 Seoul Olympics, 1991 joint entry of both North and South Korea into the United Nations, the Sunshine Policy, where South Korea engaged with North Korea. In 2002, South Korea and Japan jointly co-hosted the World Cup. 2009, South Korea went from being a major recipient to a major donor of the OECD, which marks a major milestone for South Korean economic development. They hosted the G20 summit. 2018, they hosted also the Winter Olympics, making South Korea one of the few countries that have hosted both a summer and a Winter Olympics. So South Korea's economic strengths include its auto industry, shipbuilding. In fact, South Korea is about the world's second largest shipbuilder, not in terms of numbers, but usually in terms of gross tonnage. South Korea also makes a lot of semiconductors, the chips, electronics, and I'm sure everybody's heard of K-pop. 1980s, a lot of the focus was on overseas construction projects. 1990s, more high tech. 2000s on the Korean wave, and also today, electronics, including Samsung phones. So here is a POSCO, the Pohang Steel and Iron corporation that produces steel. And what's really also interesting is you can't quite see it in this picture, but these large sheets of steel roll off the POSCO factory floor and then actually connect to the shipbuilding place, which is a different company, but it just makes it so easy. They're not shipping these large things. They're rolling off the assembly line and going right to the shipyards. The Burj Khalifa was built by a South Korean construction firm. A lot of Hyundai and Kia automobiles. Actually, Hyundai now also owns Kia, but they're the two largest automobile firms in Korea. And you might remember Gangnam Style, and now you've got a little earworm. And so here is Psy from, who made Gangnam Style, who really put Korean music on the map, and Pan Ki-moon, who was the then UN Secretary General. And more recently, you might remember Parasite, which won lots of different international awards. You might be familiar with K-beauty, the many different beauty products that Korea is famous for. And also here is Blackpink, which some people say Blackpink is actually more successful than BTS in some places, like in England, for example. And Rosé is also the new spokesperson. She has a new collaborative line with Tiffany right there. And BTS, which is a huge worldwide sensation, and Dynamite and Now Butter. They've had 2 songs out in English, and BTS is a huge worldwide phenomenon, and they are eager to come back and begin their concert tour again. And it's not just K-pop. This looks like I'm sure it looks like a concert, right? This is actually a esports video game tournament, where really the top gamers, top professional gamers have rock star status. And the Korean wave. So I've talked about this before. So this is an infographic showing how people tend to get engaged with Korean culture. So oftentimes they start out with either K-pop or K-drama, quickly move to the other, expand from there to Korean films, video games, from there to Korean food, Korean cosmetics, and not so much in the United States, but if you go to Asia, Korean fashions are also big. And usually by this time, people have started learning the Korean language, perhaps on their own, perhaps they bought the BTS, Learn Korean with BTS program, and also people often want to travel to Korea. And I'm always amazed at how many of my students, have been to Korea multiple times. They're not ethnically Korean, but they just love Korea and they go, they've been to Korea. Okay, other things you can do in Korea. You can go for the medical tourism. So you can at the airport and many other places stop by and be like, okay, I want a little bit of something done, but I don't know where to go. So they will, refer you, so that you can get whatever it is that you want done, because South Korea is really also the plastic surgery capital of the world. Other things, many people go to Korea to teach English or to study. In fact, many people go to Korea not to learn Korean, but just to study in Korea. You might end up with an engineering degree, a linguistics degree, or just study something in Korea. There are also many people who are not ethnically Korean who go to Korea to work, perhaps to marry. And so Korea, right now, about 10% of all marriages in Korea are between a Korean and a non-Korean. So South Korea really is on its way to being a multicultural country. It's not quite there yet in terms of the numbers, but it is definitely headed there. There are many women who marry Korean men, and the trends have changed a lot, but there are many women from Vietnam, from the Philippines, from China who have married Korean men. And this is a multicultural day in Korea at an elementary school, showing kids wearing clothes. So there are Korean kids, but also kids who are from who have a parent who's from China, the Philippines, Vietnam. Okay, and to bring you up to date in terms of COVID. So as of last Friday, there have been a total of, so not current cases, total of 153,789 cases, 634 new ones, positivity rate at about 1.5%, total deaths, 2009, and less than 1/3 of the people have had their first dose. Most people, I think right now, they're still only vaccinating people in their 60s and higher, but they're due to start people in their 50s and they're headed down. One of my dear friends, she's in her 40s, but she said she scored one of these kind of like the excess vaccine, like like if there's any left over at the end of the day, and you're on the list, you might be able to get one. So she's gotten one, but people are working on it. Korea really handled this COVID crisis, very proactively, very early on. So here you see people on the left who are disinfecting, and even the testing sites, they did it so that there was minimal contact, as here. And also in Korea, one of the things is people have had a long tradition of wearing masks. Even if you have a cold or it's just winter, people often wear masks. So there wasn't the same kind of resistance to doing so that you saw here. Okay, so now we are at the Q&A part, and I have managed to talk really fast to leave maybe about 10 minutes. So I'm going to stop sharing, and maybe you can tell me what's the best way for people to ask questions. Are people using the chat box or?
Yeah, we've been doing both so far, usually the chat. We can keep an eye out there. Thank you so much. That was great. So once again, in the chat, please, any questions, or if you would like to share by unmuting, please have the icon, hands up icon, and I'll call on you.
So I'd like to address questions, but also if something in my presentation sparks something and you're like, hey, I figured, you have an idea on how to incorporate Korea into your classroom, we'd definitely like to hear that as well.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I might miss why you're explaining. Can I get the reference of this like circle figure, like several circle?
Oh yeah,
in the middle, K-drama, and then it expanded to like language.
Yeah, so that's actually from a book called Hallyu 2.0.
Okay, thank you so much.
I can just put it. And you can find, I think, oops, does not like the word two. How do you do 2.0 is the name of the book. Which cities or places in South Korea are more politically progressive and which are more conservative? I would say that really varies, but it used to be that the southeast part of Korea, where Busan is, was more conservative. That's where the earlier presidents were from. The Liberal Party candidate Kim Dae-jung was from the southwest. However, I would say it's not just simply that simple. And, you know, like Seoul, the Seoul metro area has about half of all South Koreans living in, you know, within commuting distance of Seoul, even if not in Seoul itself. So there's no, you know, way to just categorize Seoul as being one or the other. Let me see. In one lecture I attended on Korea, they stated that North Korea was actually holding elections according to US monitors. Is that true? So I think, do you mean, well, North Korea today doesn't really have elections. I mean, they, you know, they supposedly have multiple parties, but really, you know, none of the Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un have actually been elected by the people. So I think probably maybe, I mean, 1948, they had elections in North Korea, and they say that they also had secret elections in the South as well. But today they don't really have elections. I mean, there's a representative body, the Korean People's Assembly, but it's really just, you know, you're basically appointed and they rubber stamp whatever Kim Jong-un wants. Not today, but before the Korean War. Yeah, 1948, under the auspices of the United States, United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea, they had they oversaw elections in both North and South. And for example, in South Korea, they actually had elections for the National Assembly, not for president. The National Assembly then, amongst themselves, appointed a leader of the National Assembly who became the president, and that's Syngman Rhee. Anybody else? Oh, I see one more. How accepting are Koreans of their emerging multicultural status? I would say it's tough. Again, Koreans aren't monolithic, so it really depends, you know, whom you talk to. But certainly, you know, it's there. And I think movies like, for example, if you've heard of Ode to My Father, this was very popular a few years ago. Movies like that really illustrating that, you know, that South Koreans were once the outsiders. The main character in Ode to My Father, he goes to Germany to as a mine worker. His wife, whom he meets in Germany, has gone as a nurse. And then he also went to Vietnam as a contractor. So the movie really shows that Korean, oh, and before that, he was a refugee from the North during the Korean War. And so it really highlights the sense of otherness of the Korean people. So I would say that on one hand, people are more accepting, but not, you know, there isn't this sense in Korea of it being a melting pot. Koreans say that they have a long homogenous history. In reality, as a historian, I can say that there's been a lot of movement of people in and out of the Korean peninsula throughout history, but there is this, you know, sense that of Korean homogeneity, which I think makes people less open to others. Is the Korean constitution constantly being rewritten, revised? Well, it was, but they're on the 6th constitution, and it's pretty much been held since 1997. I'm sorry, 1987. Seems that is happening from each president to the next, and how you describe the major changes to the election. Yeah, earlier on. So until 1987, you know, there were a series of different constitutions. Every time they changed, you know, the government. However, since 1987, they're still on the 6th constitution. Tara says, is there a reason why the history of the Jeju massacre uprising is discussed less than that of Gwangju? Oh, you're on Jeju now. I think generally, I mean, Gwangju is seen as much of a bigger thing. It's more recent and also closely tied to Kim Dae-jung and changes in sentiment in terms of like how people saw democratization, their position toward the United States. So yeah, no. So and I think overall, probably, even in Korea, Gwangju, is more recent and stands out much more. Also in terms of the popular culture, in books, movies, dramas, Gwangju's been covered a lot more. In fact, if you have Netflix, there's I think it's on Netflix, Youth of May. It just ended recently. It's a series that takes place in Gwangju in May of 1980.